Hi, my name is Nyna Nix, and this is my final comparative analysis for EH 325 Major Authors True Crime Edition. For this analysis, I will be covering how perpetrators are portrayed in Cold Blood, Helter Skelter, and Monster, and how these portrayals relate to our understanding of the true crime genre. So to start out, I actually want to revisit some of those discussion questions we talked about on the first day of class, namely, where do we draw the line? Are authors wrong for creating this content? And what are the affordances and complications of the genre? And I really think the answer to these questions lies in how authors choose to present these cases, particularly how they portray the perpetrators of these crimes. To give it in terms closer to a thesis statement, I believe that the way criminals are chosen to be portrayed in Cold Blood, Helter Skelter, and Monster illustrate where the true crime genre can succeed and fail in the coverage of real true crime cases. So let's cover In Cold Blood first. In Cold Blood was written by Truman Capote, Capote being an author and playwright beforehand. Capote was a total outsider to the case, only knowing about it from a news article he read, and he had very little in ways of experience with journalism or criminal justice. He came in as a narrative writer. In Cold Blood itself is very focused on its respective perpetrators. The text goes to great lengths to cover Smith and Hickok's lives, hardships, and their underlying humanity, which makes sense. Capote spent a lot of time interviewing them, and he expressed a very clear liking towards Perry Smith, saying he didn't think he was evil and citing their great rapport. And the text itself really reflects this sort of preference or bias he had for Smith. In fact, several pages in the book are dedicated to an anthology of letters about Smith's life, detailing his many traumas and hardships, and much of the book does. Similarly, we also have additional quotes describing the hardships that Smith and Hickok faced. This quote, of course, talking about abuse that Smith faced while in an orphanage, and this one talking about the issues Hickok had with trying to raise a family in his youth. Also worth noting is that in Capote's attempts to make the perpetrator seem sympathetic, it's often been stated that he may have fabricated multiple details. In one journalist talking with Mrs. Meyer about a scene where Perry expressed remorse, she says she never heard Perry cry, wasn't even in the room where it happened, did not hold his hand, and did not hear Perry say, "I'm embraced by shame." So, what is the significance here? Well, the way Capote chooses to portray Smith and Hickok in Cold Blood really exemplifies, to me, the issues with the genre, how bias can seep in and color how these people really were. His extreme focus on the hardships they endured also calls for some ethical concerns. It asks the reader to sympathize with these men, which runs the risk of sensationalizing or glamorizing who they are and what they did to their very real victims. The fabrication of details also lends these cases to even more sensationalism and can greatly disrespect those impacted. So, Capote's portrayal of perpetrators in Cold Blood, to me, illustrates some of the issues with misrepresenting or idolizing the people covered in this genre. So what about Helter Skelter? How does it square up? Well, unlike Capote, who came in as an outsider, this text was written by Vincent Bugliosi, the lead prosecutor on the Manson case. Bugliosi was an active participant in not just the litigation of the Mansons, but the investigation itself, which, is a lot more than most lawyers would do, I would think. As such, the novel is extensive in its coverage of this case, from the victims to the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath of the Tate LaBianca murders so many years later. I definitely call Vincent Bugliosi's approach examinary. He's very interested in the why of it all. What creates a man like Manson, and how someone like him could create such a zeitgeist over so many people. I believe that this is sort of exemplified in these two quotes. In this one, Bugliosi is theorizing about the people who follow Manson and how Manson feels about them, deducing that Manson likely didn't care about them at all, even though they would give up their entire lives for him. And then again, in talking about some records he found that claimed that Manson's father may have been black, he talks about, how that could have been the root of a lot of his racist ideology. Again, very driven by curiosity about what kind of person this is and what made him. So, unlike Capote, it's not really any sort of compassion or preference driving his portrayal of Manson forward, it's curiosity. So this text, in an examination approach to portraying Manson, exemplifies to me how true crime can be a study of sorts on how and why these sorts of things happen. Unlike in Cold Blood, it's not so much asking the reader to sympathize with anyone as it is asking the reader to question what leads a person or persons to violence like the Mansons perpetuated. It's an example of how true crime can be an informative, potentially thought-provoking genre. So how do these two texts compare to Monster? Well, Monster was written by Anne E. Schwartz, a journalist and criminal justice professor who was actually one of the original reporters to break the Dahmer case. So it's definitely got the same sort of first account nature that Helter Skelter had, but it comes from someone external to the case like In Cold Blood did. Schwartz was very focused on the victims of this case. In a podcast I found that interviewed her, she went on to say, these people were real victims. I have to remember that. And as for Dahmer's portrayal himself, we do focus on Dahmer's life and childhood and psyche in the book. Schwartz talks about his alcoholism, his sort of perverted sentimentality towards his victims, his childhood, so on. But really, that's not how Schwartz focuses on him. Primarily, she views him through the impact he had on his victims. She talks about how hard it was to listen to the grief of these families, from how Dahmer impacted them. Much like in Cold Blood, we also get like a series of statements about Dahmer, but instead of being about like his life or what type of person he was, it's from the victims. It's their impact statements at the trial. I think it's noteworthy that Schwartz remarks that Rita Isbell expressed what they had all felt for so long following a violent outburst from said person where she like attempted to attack Dahmer. I also want to note that she kind of implies this idea of focusing on Dahmer, Dahmer's victims and not so much Dahmer herself. She says, I wanted to know why. I found myself getting carried away with Dahmer's past. I felt that there just had to be an explanation. I discovered sometimes there just isn't. And I find this approach really interesting. Bugliosi is propelled by intrigue about Manson. Capote is propelled by compassion for the perpetrators. Schwartz, however, a lot of her intrigue and compassion is not towards Dahmer, but his victims. So Schwartz's portrayal of Dahmer, through his impact on others, exemplifies how true crime can bring attention and awareness to the tragedy of real events. This is especially poignant in Monster, since so many of Dahmer's victims were queer men or black and brown men, minority groups that the media and our judicial system tend to overlook. And while it's still an informative work like Helter Skelter, its information is centered around the impact Dahmer had on his victims, their family, and the Milwaukee community, rather than Dahmer himself. So to wrap this all up, I think these texts and their contrasts, seen particularly in how perpetrators are covered within them, illustrate the ways the true crime genre can excel or fail in presenting real cases. The genre can have its failures. It can focus too heavily on perpetrators and run the risk of glamorizing these individuals, like in Cold Blood does, but it can be informative and analytical and can give a voice to those whose stories don't often get told. It's all ultimately about presentation in the genre, how the information is given, the purpose of said information, and what the author has to say about said information, whether directly or indirectly. So, to wrap this up, let's revisit those original discussion questions one more time. Where do we draw the line? I say we draw the line where texts veer away from being informative or examinatory and towards glamorization, bias, or sensationalism. When it's not about informing people or making people aware of things, but when it's about making a compelling and entertaining story, or presenting a certain viewpoint. Are authors wrong for creating this content? I would say not necessarily. As long as said content is portrayed accurately, without bias, and with respect to the affected parties, I don't think any author is necessarily wrong for creating this content. What are the affordances and complications of the genre? True crime can be informative, it can bring attention to cases, and it can shed light on injustices and larger institutional problems, but it can run the risk of glamorizing or sensationalizing real crimes with real victims. And the best way to avoid these complications, once again, is for authors to remain conscientious in how and why they present these cases. And that is my works cited. Thank you so much, and thank you for a great fall 2024 semester.